Malawi seems to be on the road to recovery, not just from COVID-19, but also from the effects of a tropical storm in 2019. As part of recovery efforts, Malawi has rebased its nominal GDP, which now stands at about 8.2 trillion kwacha, around $10.9 billion. The country intends to raise 1.6 trillion kwacha in domestic revenue, mainly through taxes and levies. There's also the matter of low forex reserves. At the opening of the 2022-2023 National Budget meeting in early February, President Lazarus Chakwera said that the economic recovery measures being implemented from government's socio-economic recovery plan would help the country's GDP grow by 4.1% this fiscal year. While acknowledging that Malawi's economy remains somewhat depressed, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a number of interventions lined up to reinvigorate economic activity. He said that aside from the obvious investment in fixing the health system, the government will continue investing in fixing the infrastructure system to create employment and attract future investments. Malawi's 2022-2023 national budget is estimated at 2.84 trillion kwacha, representing 24% of the GDP, up from last fiscal year's 2.2 trillion kwacha. Implementation of this budget starts on April the 1st, 2022. Today, we're reviewing Malawi's latest budget. What does it hold for the country? This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. And joining me on the show today is Hubert Patrick Nanthambwe. He's a developmental economist and he joins Business Edge for the first time. Welcome, Hubert. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
So let's start with a picture of what Malawi's economy looked like in the past 1 to 2 years. This is coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also coming out of the very harsh effects of extreme weather that were caused by that cyclone in 2019. So paint a picture for us. What was Malawi's economy like in the past 1 to 2 years?
All right. Malawi's economy had been doing good, especially since the year 2016. We had been experiencing a continuous growth, especially in the government revenue, to talk about GDP. But then after 2019, when we had just experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, and that cyclone disaster, most of the effects were experienced in 2020. Because like in 2019, we were somewhere around 5.4 increase in GDP as compared to the previous year. While coming to the year 2020, we experienced only a 0.8% increase in GDP. That was to do with the effects that had been experienced, especially starting from 2019. But that was not only it. If you can also look at the welfare of the people, like in the year 2019, the welfare of the people was also steadily rising, almost every year, about 1.8% increase in the GDP per capita. While in the year 2020, we experienced that the welfare now dropped with an equal margin of about 1.8%. So we could see that such effects were also affecting the welfare, and not to talk about borrowing, because now, since the COVID-19 pandemic had come in with the rising need to provide for health services that were not there initially in Malawi, the government had to spend more and it had to borrow more. So we could see the debt to GDP ratio in the year 2020 rising to 65%, which was not the case, especially in the year 2019 and before, where we were somewhere around 40-something% of the GDP as in the debts. So that's how I can say the situation has been like with the coming in.
Okay, and we'll talk more about the debts conversation in a bit. So let's look now at this new budget that's out for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. It's projected at 2.84 trillion kwacha, representing just under 25% of the GDP. And this is up from 2.2 trillion from last year, which also ran only for 9 months. So where's this increase in spending coming from, or where rather is the increase in spending going?
All right, talking about the government spending, especially in the year 2022, firstly, maybe we should see what this spending is composed of. Because if we look at the government spending, it's composed of the recurrent spendings and the development spendings. So if you look at the recurrent spendings, you can see that in the year 2022 to 2023 budget, the recurrent spendings are estimated to be somewhere around 71%, which is a bit lower as compared to the previous year of 2021, when we had somewhere about 74% of the recurrent expenditure percentage of the total expenditure. So we can see that there have been adjustments, even though the figures have risen up, but the percentage composition, we can see that much has now gone to the development expenditure, which has to do with the infrastructural development. But also at the recurrent expenditure, we can see that now the government, when it was coming in, it had a lot of promises to do with subsidies, to do with welfare of the people, the social cash transfers. So all such things, we can see that for the government to still stand, to its promises, it is willing now to spend such huge amounts of monies, so it meets what it had planned. But so far, I can say the expenditures are just not much different as in percentage composition from how they were last year. But only that, I think we just have an increase. And considering now that this fiscal year is composed of 12 months as compared to the last fiscal year, which was only composed of 9 months due to the restructuring of the fiscal year that happened last year.
Okay, so I'm happy you brought up the issue of recurrent expenses, and that's roughly estimated around maybe 2 trillion kwacha, coming to about 17.7% of the GDP and 71.1% of total expenditure. You've mentioned some of the promises made by this president administration when they came into power, into leadership. What's being done to address the issue of recurrent expenditures? Are there no places, no gaps that the government finds that they can find a way to reduce the recurrent expenses?
Talking about these recurrent expenses, there are ways or there are measures that this government has put in place, and it has also stated them in the budget. But maybe if we have to understand about the recurrent expenditures, because here we are talking about these expenditures that have to do with employee compensations, issues to do with the subsidies, and all such type of government expenditures that do not have to do with the assets or infrastructural development. So if you look at this, the government now, it has put some cautions to say, or some measures, I should say, to say, it is now trying to come in and review the benefits or the compensations that were there for senior government officials. So maybe just to make sure that where they can revise, they can save some monies. They have also committed to say they want now to review the policy that has to do with asset management, especially the costs that are involved in servicing the assets of the government. So what the government is doing now is like it wants to try to make sure that it minimizes the number of assets, especially we should talk about vehicles and the likes that are involved, so that when it comes to these costs of servicing these assets, which also belong to the recurrent expenditure, at least maybe we can try as much as possible to minimize the costs. And I also heard the minister, when he was addressing the parliament, he mentioned something to do with the process of purchasing fertilizers. They said previously, when they are trying to purchase fertilizers, they were using some middle agents, so the costs, for them to acquire the fertilizers and then for them to disburse and to do all such kinds of things were so high. So now what the government is doing is it is eliminating all these middle stages. So it wants to be dealing directly with the providers of such things, so that when it is trying to pay for costs associated with importing or purchasing such issues, at least we should bear minimum costs so as to be cautious with the recurrent expenditure.
Okay, that works. So let me quickly ask before we go for a break now. Even with a higher budget, we've seen Malawi's budget deficit actually decrease. In the previous fiscal year, even though that was 9 months, it was 8.3%. For this one, it's projected to be about 7.7%. How has this decrease in the budget deficit come about?
All right. Okay. So if we have to look at the GDP, or I should say the budget deficit, especially for the year 2020, and for the year 2021. We can see that during the year 2020, even though we are a bit trying to progress towards recovery from the effects of COVID, especially towards the end of the year 2020, but still, there were a number of issues that had to be done or to be addressed in the short period of time. So we could see that there were a lot of interventions that were supposed to be done, a lot of purchases that were supposed to be done, that were trying to create this big gap in the deficit of the budget, especially in the year 2020 and 2021. While coming to 2022, this 2022, we could see that in the year 2021, at least things were getting a little bit back to normal as they were before the coming in of the pandemic. We could see the global supply chain markets opening. We could see visitors now, the tourism sector attracting some tourists and generating some government revenue. We could see production happening now as normal activities were getting back to normal. So at least we had a little bit increase in the GDP, because we experienced, it should be something like 3.9% increase in the GDP in 2021 as compared to the increase that was experienced in the year 2020 as compared to the year 2019. So we can see that this increase in the budget, in the GDP, or to say government revenue, may be necessitated as to have some chance to maybe do more of the budget and have some less deficit as compared to the previous year.
Sure. All right. Okay, Hubert, we're going to take a break now, but when we come back, we'll get more into the debt conversation. There were some statements from the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs in relation to how Malawi wants to address its debt situation. So we'll pick up the pieces of the conversation from there. How is Malawi going to bring down its debt, which the minister has promised to do, and use this budget to start the country on a downward trajectory of debt sustainability? That conversation piece will continue after this. You're still watching Business Edge right here on News Central. Still with me is Hubert Patrick Nanthambwe. He's a developmental economist as we look at Malawi's new budget that's focusing on growth. Now, debt has become a reoccurring theme when it comes to African economies and their budgets. The Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs for Malawi said that the deficits in this year's budget will be financed through foreign borrowing amounting to about 237.07 billion kwacha and domestic borrowing accounting for about 653.98 billion. So, Hubert, let me bring you back in here. How much debt does Malawi have right now? Just very briefly, you touched on the debt to GDP ratio conversation. Of course, there's the debt sustainability, and it's about a debt to revenue conversation. Where does Malawi stand? What's the country's debt profile as it is now?
Okay, Malawi, just like many other countries, are heavily indebted as of now. Because like in Malawi, if we talk about the rebased, I think, amounts, then we should be somewhere around 8.1 trillion Malawi kwacha in the debt. That represents something like 66% of the GDP. Surely, so that's the extent of debt now in Malawi.
All right, so the minister mentioned that the ministry would be reviewing the domestic debt profile with a view to restructuring debt towards a longer maturity period. And with longer maturities, also said that there's a plan for a policy that would lean towards concessional borrowing, preferring grants, and only under very strict circumstances would Malawi contract non-concessional loans for high-value investments. This plan, as it is, do you think it's enough to address the debt sustainability concerns for the country?
All right. Talking about debt sustainability, if we have to worry about debt sustainability, then actually we are talking about the capacity of the government to fulfill the obligations of repaying back the loans, especially to the creditors. So if we look at the current debt to GDP ratio, we can see that it's indeed high, and no wonder the government is concerned. But then this restructuring that is there, it is something that you have to request and you have to be accepted. So I believe if Malawi is accepted especially on the request that it has to restructure its debts so it can pay over a longer period of time, then at least we can have the chance to fulfill the obligations of repaying these loans. But otherwise, as we can see the situation now, I can't call it out of hand, but I can say it's about to be out of hand. So we indeed need to stop borrowing. The government need to put in measures, especially as you have also said, to say those concessional loans that maybe there should be some minimum interest rates just on those loans, so that the government maybe in the long term can manage to fulfill its obligations to pay back the loan and avoid, failure to pay back such loans.
So has the request been made by Malawi now to its external creditors to restructure their loans? What stage of the conversation is it right now?
Okay, currently, as heard from the minister when he was presenting that budget, it's like the status is not yet on the ground, but then they plan now once they move out of the parliament and they start implementation of the budget. So they plan to start engaging the external creditors and to try to see how best they can resolve the issue. But still, the issue, remember, it takes us back to the year 2019 when IMF conducted some sustainability analysis for Malawi. So by that time, the debt to GDP ratio, it was somewhere around 45%, and Malawi was found to be debt sustainable. Like it was some country that was believed that it will fulfill its obligations to pay back the loans. But coming to 2021 and currently as we stand, I believe as the negotiations if the negotiations can base on such findings in the 2019 IMF findings and then try to refer how the situation has changed now, I believe Malawi can be considered, and let's hope everything will work.
All right. Sure. So one thing we also heard from the minister is that the Public Finance Management Act of 2003 was going to be reviewed to address some of the gaps in the current legal framework on the issues of contracting public debt. What kind of gaps are there that need to be plugged, or at least need to be amended, so that Malawi can tighten up on its public debt contracting?
All right, talking about gaps in the especially amendment of the management of finances, public finances, that Act of 2003. I recall there was an assessment done in the year somewhere around 2010, if not 2011, by the Minister of Finance, where they were observed a number of issues that had to be addressed. One of them could be the amount of borrowings, like it was not properly slated as to how much, to what extent can a country borrow? Because if we have to refer now to studies, they say at least for a country to be somewhere okay with the borrowings, or for the borrowings to be able to effectively contribute towards the development of the country, at least they should be somewhere below 60% or so. So if we look at such an assessment that found out that there were some limitations as to what extent can the government borrow, and also looking at the problems that were found, especially in the digitized finance management tools that the government had produced as of that time. They had problems, especially to do with the documentation of the loans and the loan repayments, and even accumulation of loans that were lagging. So I believe such gaps are the ones that the government wants to iron out by reviewing the act, so that by the end of the day we can have an act that should effectively help to bailing out the government out of the debt crisis. Sure.
Okay. So finally, Hubert, before I let you go, Malawi's economy is projected to grow around 4% annually for the next 2 years. Is this good enough for the kind of recovery that Malawi needs? What do you think will drive this growth, particularly over the next 2 years?
All right, talking about the growth rate about Malawi, I think the 4-point-something growth rate is okay for now. It looks realistic, since the times that we are passing through as a country, it requires a lot of spendings, requires a lot of restructurings, it requires a lot of spendings in the development sector. So it's like there will be losses in the short term, but at least there can be expected some gains in the longer term period in time. But so the 4% for me looks okay, is realistic, and so that's fine. But then looking at how best the country can go, because as I was looking at the budget address, we could see that the budget was termed accelerating implementation towards wealth creation, job creation, and welfare. So we can see that this budget has mostly focused on the issues to do with maybe wealth creation and maybe the welfare creation. But on the job creation, I haven't seen much being done, especially so that we can acquire jobs. For example, I have seen a lot of maybe incentives to do with tax being offered, maybe just to do with issues of maybe stimulating production. But then the stimulants of production are not being accompanied maybe by issues to do with lowering the costs to do with employers, recruitment and the likes. Okay. So I was thinking we could borrow from other countries like South Africa. I've seen they have now intensified on employee taxation incentives that allows maybe the companies to employ less experienced guys. We can talk of graduates, we can talk of diploma holders, we can talk of those guys from the technical colleges. So it tries to employ such guys and maybe pay less taxes. The government makes the companies pay less taxes to the government, so that these companies are encouraged maybe to employ more of these guys. And as we can see, such type of strategies have worked more in many of the countries. So I was thinking that maybe if we also try to come up with measures, not only to do with tax incentives, but other measures that can try as much as possible to boost employment, so that as we are boosting the capacity, we also boost the number of employees that are there in order to meet the capacity, so that we can experience some gains in the longer term.
All right, sure. Hubert, we'll leave it at that for now. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
All right. And a 4% or 4.1% GDP growth rate and a 4% GDP growth rate for 2022 and 2023 seems reasonable, with a 2.84%, with a 2.4 trillion kwacha budget for Malawi in 2022 and 2023. These are projections. Will the year bear out what the government has in plan for the country? We'll, of course, be watching to see how things play out. You're watching Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And here are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. Of course, the business world right now is feeling the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Oil has risen in Asian trading on concerns that financial sanctions on Russia may impede global fuel supply chains, following a wild session in which prices spiked more than 9% before giving up gains. Brent for April settlement advanced 2.7% to $101.77 after closing up 2.3% in the previous session, when it peaked at just over $105, and that's the highest since August 2014. WTI for April delivery climbed 2.9% to $95.46, and front-month futures are up 4.8% this week. And it's not just oil that has risen. Gold has also advanced, with investors remaining on edge as they assess the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Western sanctions. Gold fell a day earlier after surging to the highest in more than 17 months as traders digested weaker than expected sanctions on Russia following the country's attack on its neighbors. Gold's rally could have a lot further to go if a resulting commodity price spike leads to concerns of a material slowdown in growth in developed markets. Total Energies SE has made a significant oil discovery off the coast of Namibia, 3 weeks after Shell announced another find off the southwest African nation. Explorers have drilled over a dozen wells off the coastline of the country in search of oil and gas. The potential opening of a new basin comes at a time when African countries are looking to benefit from natural resources amid rising opposition to the use of climate-warming fossil fuels. And finally, Kenya has launched a fresh assault on the multi-billion shilling betting industry with legislative proposals that restrict gambling to five-star hotels with casinos. The country is looking to impose a 4-year jail term or a 10 million shillings fine for opening outside of operating hours. The Nairobi City County Betting, Lotteries and Gaming Amendment Bill 2021 seeks to restrict the betting and gambling establishments in the city to operating between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. And those are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. You're, of course, watching Business Edge right here on News Central, and we're wrapping things up for the week. Don't forget to make it a date with me right here, 11 a.m. West African time, Monday through Friday, where we put African business, the economy, and finance front and center. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Have a fantastic weekend.